In this section, we will discuss vSphere high availability architecture. If we look at this cluster, we can see there are 3 ESXi hosts, and one of those hosts is considered to be the master ESXi host, and the other 2 are configured to be slaves. So let's look at the vSphere high availability architecture agent communication. There are multiple hosts in the cluster, and we call that a fault domain. The fault domain is managed by a master host. And when high availability is enabled, the fault domain manager service runs on each host. vCenter server sends a list of hosts and protected virtual machines to the master host, and the master host sends heartbeats to slave hosts. If a slave host does not respond to the heartbeat, then that means it's crashed, so the virtual machines are started on another ESXi host. A network heartbeat. A network heartbeat is a signal which is sent from the master to the slave, and then the slave responds, indicating that it is still up and running. But what if there is a failed slave host? If there's a failed ESXi slave host, then the master no longer receives heartbeats, and that means that the host has failed, so the virtual machines are started on another host. But what if there is a failed master host? If there is a failed master host, then the slaves no longer receive heartbeats. So then the slaves hold an election and elect a new master host based upon management object ID, and then the new master host sends heartbeats to the slave hosts. We have 2 types of heartbeats. There are network heartbeats, which are sent and received over the management network, and there are Datastore heartbeats, which are sent and received over the Datastore network. Network heartbeats are sent over the management network, and the master sends heartbeats to the slave hosts, and if the slave host does not respond, then the master must make a decision. Is the problem a crashed ESXi host, or is it simply a network connectivity failure? In other words, why isn't the master receiving heartbeats? How does it know if it's a crashed host or a network connectivity failure? How does it make that decision? And the answer is Datastore heartbeats. A Datastore network is the storage area network, and it can act as a backup for the management network. And if a host can receive heartbeats from the Datastore network, but it does not receive heartbeats from the management network, that indicates that the host is still running, but there's just a cabling problem. Now, if it does not get a heartbeat from either network, then that indicates a failed or isolated host. An isolated host. If the master is not receiving management network heartbeats, and if it's not receiving Datastore network heartbeats, well, that implies that we have an isolated host, in which case vSphere starts the virtual machines on another ESXi host. Let's look at the configuration of that. Under vSphere high availability, under Edit, I select Response for Host Isolation, and right now it's disabled. But if I select the drop-down, I can configure it to shut down the isolated host and restart the virtual machines on another host. Design considerations. Host isolation events can be minimized through good design by ensuring that management and Datastore networks are on physically separate networks, and by having redundant data paths, which is available in Network Interface Card Teaming. And this concludes our section on high availability